Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next moment with NCDHH Advocacy Specialists. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about, through our jobs and for some of our lives, we have faced some unusual situations. People have had misunderstandings. They've said silly things. They may not understand that people who are deaf can do certain things. So part of our job is to really educate people about effective communication, and not that deaf can't, but that deaf can. So today I thought we'd go around the horn and through this job, or maybe through past life experiences, talk about some situations that we've faced and how we can teach people the right way, so to speak. So I'm just going to randomly pick one of the advocacy specialists to start off, and they'll tell their experiences and their stories. First of all, we'll go with Aaron.
The moment I remember the most was during a presentation about our services. We provide trainings to law enforcement agencies on a variety of subjects, including how to interact with deaf drivers. After the presentation, I had several people exclaim that they didn't know that deaf people could drive, which really surprised me. This is something that has persisted in many of the presentations and conventions that I have worked at. I suspect the reason for it being that in my area, there's not a large amount of deaf people, and most may have not met a deaf person before. On the flip side of that, though, I was at a law enforcement convention about 2 years back, talking to an officer there. I mentioned some of the sign cards we have. They're little cards that people can point to in order to explain the situation without having to speak. They have things on there like yes, no, so on and so forth, little pictures. I offered him one of those and he declined. He actually retrieved the very same card, a little worse for wear, that one of my previous coworkers had given him from one of his side pockets. And I really appreciated how he was prepared for that very situation. He took it seriously, which was really cool to see.
Oh yeah, yeah, I hear that a lot. You know, people people who are deaf can drive. I mean, how do they hear? How do they hear ambulances? And it's like they've lights. There's lights that flash. It's not always relied on sound. So thank you, Aaron, for that. Next, we'll go with Dylan. So this is an experience I've seen off and on, but it really hit hard during my college years when I was studying deaf language and deaf people encountering the criminal justice system. So while interviewing police and lawyers and things, they told me that they thought ASL was a subset of English, meaning if you signed an ASL, then you should be able to understand English because the words are the same. And I said, no, that's not true. ASL is a language and it is different. It has its own grammar structure, it has its own vocabulary and things like that. So someone who is signing an ASL doesn't always mean that they can understand English. So that is why a lot of people who are deaf, they say, well, I don't understand. What are my rights and all of that in criminal justice? It's because of the language difference. So we need to close that gap. You know, the experiences I had during college studying criminal justice, they think that people who are deaf can understand English. So it's a different thought process. It's different in communication and style and things like that. Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah, body language, facial expressions, written and spoken and signing is so different. And yeah, we need to educate people about that. And that's part of our job here. All right, next is Kathy. Take it away.
All right, I'm going to talk about not so much miscommunication as a misunderstanding in vocabulary. I find a lot of times when I'm talking to people, I will say something about I'm with the Nebraska Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and they say, "Oh, the deaf," and they instead of saying DEAF, they say DEATH. And to me, that's really frustrating because my initial thought is deaf people are not dead. And of course, I don't say that to them like that, but I do explain and point out the spelling of deaf and say it's DEAF. Deaf means not able to hear. And so that's probably one of the things that I come across a lot. I really do hear that. And I've noticed it on different videos, different times that people have said death instead of deaf. So that's something that I really do try to educate people on and explain to them what deaf means.
Great. Yeah. There's a lot of older phone text programs that have that autocorrect. Deaf automatically changed to death. So they're better now, but in the past, those texting apps would automatically autocorrect to death with the TH instead of deaf with an F. So next, we'll go with Kim. I'm still surprised sometimes, especially in the rural areas. In big cities, because of social awareness and things like that, not so much. But in rural areas, whether they're elderly or young, even some young people still say, and what they say is deaf and dumb. They use that term based on their perspective. The dumb, sometimes that can relate to Aristotle, the famous quote that said, if you can't hear, you can't think. So that kind of, that's very strong in my opinion. Or they say deaf and mute. But if you look at the dictionary for the definition of mute, it means you have no ability to make any sound from your vocal cords. People who are deaf can shout. If they can't speak, that's fine, but they still have the ability to vocalize. They just don't know how to speak correctly, maybe. And maybe they can yell, or maybe they can say certain words. And I always put humor into this too. You know, sometimes people who are deaf, I'll tell you what, they can say those cuss words perfectly. They can't say anything else, but those cuss words, they can tell. So that surprises me sometimes to see that. Really, and it's related to some of my experiences too. My oldest daughter, I have 3 children. My oldest daughter, when she was born, I had a neighbor that grew up with in my mom's neighborhood, and she thought my daughter was my sister's. I said, no, she's my daughter. And she looked at me and she's, well, deaf people can't have children. And she said that to all the neighbors, the people at church, and she said she was spreading around that this child was my sister's when it was my child. So it's very interesting how people have a mindset. And this person was older at that time. They were in their 90s. Some people just can't change their mindset, and we just have to try to accept that and move on. But nowadays we can still educate and create change and just get rid of those mindsets. So, and it is very offensive, but it's like you said, it's part of our job to educate, Cody. And that's a fun part of our job. Right, right. Back then they thought, oh, you can't teach people who are deaf. They are unable to learn. Well, we of course know that's not true. I'm glad you brought up people who don't speak and they sign, but yet they can very much vocalize those cuss words, those swear words. Very true. So for me, I had experience growing up. I was in high school, and I like to educate in a real genuine way back then. So I went to a restaurant with my family, and we were all sitting at a table. Obviously, my family signs, and the waitress, before even asking us, she brought us Braille menus. Brought those over to the table, and they brought one over for me. But actually they only brought one for me and not my family. And I wanted to say, I don't know what this is. So I put the Braille menu up to my ear and I told the waitress, this isn't working. And the waitress took a while to think, what? She didn't quite understand it at first, that I had it up to my ear, that I'm deaf, and so a Braille menu doesn't work for me. So she finally got it, and she apologized all over herself, went and got me a regular menu. But a big part of our comments here and our job is to share and educate the community, because learning is a big part of culture, people understanding people's cultures. And people say some things that are ridiculous or foolish, but it's our job to educate them. So, and that's a big part of our job. So I hope you enjoyed hearing some of our stories today and how we try to give back to the hard of hearing community and educate our stakeholders out there. Thank you.